Howdy, y'all. On May 24th, 2022, an 18-year-old gunman entered Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, and killed 19 children and 2 adults. Following this shooting, Republicans came out to act shocked such a thing could occur. Well, no. Actually, the first thing they did was find a photo of a trans woman who looked vaguely like the shooter and falsely claimed this was evidence that the shooter was a transsexual leftist illegal alien. Yeah, the immediate response to a bunch of children getting murdered was, how can we use this to hurt immigrants and trans people? But after that, they pretended to be very shocked that such a surprising, senseless tragedy could occur right here in the United States. And while these shootings are tragic, and they are senseless, they are not surprising, and they haven't been surprising for a long time. The US has hundreds of mass shootings every single year. Mass shootings have only gone up for the past 4 years straight. There were 692 mass shootings in 2021 alone, and there have been more than 200 so far in 2022. These shootings are not surprise aberrations, but rather an inevitable result of decades of refusal to pass even the most basic of gun control legislation. In this video, we're going to take a look at how Republicans pretend there's no way to prevent mass shootings, with a focus on school shootings in particular, debunk their tired talking points, and look at what Democratic politicians, and the rest of us, need to do to put an end to the ever-growing pile of child corpses. But first, I have a demon core here, and I'd like to open it. Alright, got my screwdriver, and a 1, and a 2. Howdy, y'all. Okay, so the first step to pretending nothing can be done to prevent mass shootings is by treating every shooting as a surprising, singular event. By only looking at each shooting in a vacuum, they can treat it as a one-off tragedy and ignore the wider societal trend that it isn't a one-time occurrence. And if each shooting is a surprise, they are able to pretend the shooting couldn't have been prevented by, more sensible gun control laws. This is why, whenever someone responds to a mass shooting by proposing gun control legislation, they'll say, "Stop politicizing tragedy." Because when you talk about gun control in response to a mass shooting, you're acknowledging that these shootings are not a one-off, but a continuous problem, as well as that they are preventable tragedies. The Republican post-mass shooting ritual is thoughts and prayers because it allows them to seem sympathetic, but they don't have to actually acknowledge why this keeps happening, do anything about it, or stop taking money from the NRA. This politicizing tragedy angle also lets conservatives take shots at anyone who wants to stop all the child murder. They'll shame you for talking about gun control before the bodies are even cool, but this is shit. Using the politicizing tragedy argument to push back on gun control is politicizing tragedy. These people are dead because of political decisions, and there will never be enough time for the bodies to cool because by the time they have, there's already a new shooting, a fresh supply of warm corpses preventing any discussion of gun control. And of course, while they're willing to shame anyone else for politicizing the tragedy, conservatives are some of the quickest to make political statements following a mass shooting. The most common is saying, "We don't have a gun problem, we have a mental health problem," or "We have a video game problem," or "We have a Discord problem," or "We have a transgender immigrant problem." But this isn't honest. While yes, America does have a mental health problem, believe me, my mom works in mental health, I get to hear about it all the time, blaming school shootings on mental health is simply shifting the blame away from guns and placing stigma on a group that doesn't deserve it. The majority of people with mental illnesses do not commit mass shootings, and the majority of mass shooters do not have mental illnesses. When someone commits a heinous act, many will immediately think that person is mentally ill. because they can't fathom a sane person doing such a thing. But these assertions just lead to oversimplifying the problem and making things worse for non-violent people with mental illnesses. By attributing mass shootings to mental illness, conservatives are able to blame something other than guns, but they don't want to pass any laws to help with mental illness either. They only ever talk about it when someone brings up gun control. Texas's Governor Greg Abbott is blaming the Uvalde shooting on mental health, yet he cut $211 million from the state's mental health budget in April. And finally, because you knew this was coming, the mass shootings are a mental health problem rhetoric has a tinge of racism to it as well. An analysis of news coverage of mass shootings found that white men were more likely to have their shootings attributed to mental illness than were black men. But these "we don't have a gun problem, we have a whatever problem" arguments all fall apart when you compare America to other countries. Every other developed nation has people with mental illnesses, video games, probably even transgender immigrants. But none have mass shootings on the scale of the US because they all have some degree of gun control that America lacks. But it's not enough to simply deflect blame onto anything but guns. Republican politicians know they at least kind of have to pretend to care just a little bit about the trend of large groups of children being slaughtered in their classrooms. So whenever one of these shootings happen, they're quick to propose their solutions. The only problem is, their solutions don't address the actual problem. They just waste money without saving anybody, and in many ways actively make things worse. You see, rather than prevent school shootings entirely, by not letting these bastards get their hands on guns in the first place, a conservative solution is rather to increase security at schools. This can come in the form of see-through backpacks, metal detectors, limiting the school to one entrance and one exit, having armed school resource officers and arming teachers. But all of these ideas are just plain stupid. See-through backpacks are a violation of both student privacy and fashion code. Metal detectors need operators, so we'll need to foot the bill for that. A small price to pay for a child's safety, perhaps, except for the fact that having metal detectors and see-through backpacks wouldn't stop school shootings. In most of these cases, the shooter isn't sneaking the gun into the school in the morning. Rather, they're just showing up in the middle of the day and entering the building while class is already in session. You know, when your afternoon plans are murdering your classmates, you aren't necessarily itching to get to school in time for first hour. For the more architecturally inclined, several Republicans, including Senator Ted Cruz, believe the solution is to have one door in and out of the school. Now, in the case of the shooting in Uvalde, the shooter entered the building, barricaded himself in one of the classrooms, and proceeded to kill almost everyone inside of that room. Ted is proposing a scenario where a potential shooter would merely have to enter the building, barricade the singular exit, and the school would then be essentially a holding pen for the shooter to easily slaughter everyone inside. I'm trying to make a point here about how all these ideas just inconvenience normal school life without actually doing anything to help against school shootings. And I was totally ready to say something like, not having multiple exits is a fire hazard. But I don't know, I'm just kind of blown away by Ted Cruz's turn the schools into murder cages plan. Holy shit, dude. How is this greasy ass butter cow motherfucker actually a senator? And then there's the idea to have armed personnel at the school. In practice, this takes the form of school resource officers, or SROs, which are cops that work in the school. Another proposal is arming teachers, but we'll get to that one in a bit. Now, ever since Columbine, the number of SROs in the country has skyrocketed, thanks to billions in federal grants, as well as states like Florida having laws mandating them in every school. Now, it's debatable if SROs are a good thing to have in schools in general. The widespread implementation of them has correlated with a slight reduction in crime, But conversely, in schools with SROs, students are more likely to face criminal consequences for minor crimes that would typically just be handled internally by the school administration. SROs have also repeatedly been found to respond disproportionately to minor offenses by students, particularly towards students with learning disabilities. In one instance, a 19-year-old boy enrolled in a special ed classroom muttered some comments at two SROs. The SROs would arrange a private meeting with the boy, and in the meeting, the SRO placed him in a chokehold and strangled him until he was unconscious. In another case, an SRO handcuffed an 8-year-old for refusing to sit down. And while these are certainly not representative of every single SRO, there's a definitive trend of SROs responding with excessive force because the children that they're theoretically protecting mildly upset them. But while the value of SROs for everyday life is debatable, the value during a school shooting is certainly not. Because SROs don't do shit to protect kids during school shootings. In a study looking at the severity of school shootings in schools with and without an SRO present, it was found that not only are SROs not correlated with reduced deaths, but the amount of deaths is actually greater on average with an SRO present. Now, while the amount of school shootings in the US is morally repugnant, it's not the insanely large 10,000 cases sample size one typically looks for in statistics. So the conclusion that SROs increase school shooting deaths could be a slight reach, but there's no basis to suggest they prevent them. In Parkland, Florida, the school's SRO famously just stood outside the building and waited as the shooter murdered 17 people. Even in cases where the SRO actually does something, such as the shooting at Oxford High School in Michigan, where the shooter was apprehended by the school's SRO, that didn't happen until after the other first responders had already arrived and 11 people had already been shot. But for the most blatant example of why SROs, and indeed cops in general, are a bad solution for school shootings, we need look no further than the Uvalde shooting. Robb Elementary had an armed security officer at the school, and there have been a mountain of conflicting reports on what the officer did as local law enforcement attempts to cover their asses. More info will probably come out as I'm editing this video, but early accounts said that the officer exchanged fire with the shooter, while more recent accounts are saying they didn't. But whatever the truth is, plain and simple, the SRO let a shooter into the school. And as cops arrived on the scene, they didn't make things better. While they got to the school within minutes, it took nearly an hour to actually end the shooting when a border patrol squad gained access to the classroom the shooter had barricaded himself inside, which is to say, they had a staff member open the door with a key, and then one of the agents shot the shooter. For the hour or so in between the start of the shooting and the shooter's death, police just kinda stood around outside. While children were inside bleeding to death, parents were outside screaming at the cops to do something, anything, to save their kids. One of the parents, Angeli Rose Gomez, heard about the shooting, drove 40 miles to the school, arrived, and upon witnessing the police doing nothing, she and others started yelling at them to go stop the shooter. Instead of saving any children from the murderer, the police began instead to handcuff and pepper spray Gomez and the other parents. Gomez, fortunately, knew some of the officers and was able to convince them to remove her handcuffs. She then hopped the fence and saved her children herself, while the police continued to do nothing. And this mistreatment of the parents continued after the shooting. When the children were being loaded onto buses to take them away from the school, one father approached the bus to get his kid. The police, who had been so non-confrontational to the murderer inside the building, had no issue tasing the parent desperately trying to get to their kid outside of the building. But the police were not content merely to let children die through their inaction, because even when taking out the shooter, they did everything they could to increase his victim count. One of the children in the classroom that the shooter barricaded himself in told reporters that he and several other students had hidden under tables while the shooter was in the room. When the cops finally arrived at the room, they did literally the dumbest fucking thing you can ever do if you're responding to a shooter. As the boy says, when the cops came in, the cops said, "Yell if you need help." And one of the persons in my class said, "Help." The shooter overheard and he came in and shot her. All around the United States, children are trained in what to do during an active shooter situation. Kids as young as kindergarten know when bullets start ringing, they should get down, stay quiet, and hide from the shooter. Trained adult cops are apparently too fucking stupid to realize have the kids give away their location to the guy trying to kill them is a bad idea. So if SROs don't work, and police officers in general don't work, how about arming teachers? Well, this is kind of like if you took the SRO idea and somehow made it dumber. You see, if police, who have a level of combat training that's frankly kind of disproportionate to what they actually do most of the time, suck this hard at stopping shooters, having a teacher whose training deals more in geometry than guns be the main line of defense wouldn't improve safety. Then there's the whole thing that, everyone at school now knows the exact location of a gun. A shooter could simply steal the gun and save themselves a trip to the local sporting goods store. Not to mention the potential of the armed teacher themselves to shoot somebody. Many teachers and students will feel uncomfortable in a school where several teachers are armed. For the students, this could impede their ability to learn, and for the teachers, this could lead to many quitting. When the University of Texas started allowing firearms on campus, many professors resigned. This idea, like all the other conservative ideas really, would also be insanely expensive, since you'd have to pay for quality firearms, training for the teachers, and any legal fees that the school incurs related to the firearm. Conservative politicians, who are so penny pinching when it comes to actual education, appear to have no problem wasting a bunch of money to make schools less safe. And it's a tall ask to expect teachers to sacrifice themselves in the event of a shooter. In pretty much every one of these shootings, teachers and students do show tremendous bravery in putting themselves in danger to save others, and they deserve to be commended for that. But this cannot be the expectation. Teachers are supposed to educate students, not die for them. All of these conservative solutions seek to stop school shootings by putting more guns in schools. But that just doesn't stop anything. The literal best case scenario is that you're able to stop a shooter after they've only shot a couple people. But it's far more likely it does jack shit. Because turning schools into prison-like complexes with metal detectors, no privacy, one door, and armed guards doesn't address the actual issue, which is the ability of these shooters to get their guns in the first place. Now, if you were to listen to conservative media, the only gun control policy that's ever been proposed is ban all guns. And while sure, that is an approach some have suggested, there's many more forms of gun control with varying degrees of support. Some of the most popular are universal background checks, which would mean people who aren't allowed to purchase guns aren't able to just go buy one from a gun show or some other private seller. Safe storage laws, which mandate that guns be stored in a locked safe when not in use. This law would be particularly helpful in curbing school shootings, as 80% of K-12 school shooters got their guns by stealing them from family members. And red flag laws, which allow a person who is deemed a danger to themselves or others to have their guns temporarily seized, so they don't, kill anybody. Gun control legislation is frequently framed as an attack on responsible gun owners, but the vast majority of proposals are focused not on keeping guns out of the hands of responsible gun owners, but rather on keeping them out of the hands of people who aren't responsible gun owners, such as children and those with a history of violence. As for further proposals, some with not quite universal but still majority support are banning high-capacity magazines. See, mass shooters tend to favor high-capacity magazines as it lets them kill the maximum number of people before needing to reload. I really don't get the argument against this one. I initially assumed it was just people who were too lazy to reload, but I found some Washington state senator who said banning high-capacity magazine puts in jeopardy the lives of law-abiding citizens, especially women. But if your assailant takes half a dozen bullets and doesn't go down, odds are it's some kind of werewolf, in which case you'd only need one silver bullet. No high-capacity magazine needed. There's also just over majority support for policies banning the sale of assault weapons and instituting mandatory buybacks of assault weapons. This is similar to the policies Australia enacted in 1996 in response to its own mass shootings. And it's worked there, as only one mass shooting has occurred in Australia since. When all else fails, the conservative arguing against gun control has one last failsafe: invoking a portion of a constitutional amendment. Now, listen here, buckaroo. Unlike you loony lefties, I happen to know a thing or two about the Constitution. And it says that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Ah yes, the old 2A. More specifically, just the second half of it. The amendment in full reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Now, why does this amendment, supposedly championing individual gun ownership, have a line about well-regulated militias? Well, up until relatively recently, the amendment was interpreted in a way that meant the right to individual gun ownership could be tied to membership in a militia. Until 2008, when in District of Columbia v. Heller, the Supreme Court decided to pretend that the amendment just mentioned well-regulated militias because it was different and not like the other girls, but that it didn't actually mean it. So the precedent that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to individual gun ownership has been around 1 year less than Shrek the Third. But now it's here, and it's here to stay. No gun control, baby! Well, yes, we now have the precedent set by the Heller case, and the conservative majority on the Supreme Court means that's unlikely to change in the near future. This ruling doesn't make gun control unconstitutional. In the 2010 McDonald v. City of Chicago case, which expanded the scope of the Heller case to the states, the court still reaffirmed that reasonable restrictions on gun ownership would remain constitutional. But also, we strayed very far from the originalist interpretation of the Constitution, which conservative justices claim to champion. The actual people who wrote these amendments would be pretty confused by the interpretation and debates surrounding them today. And not just because they'd no longer have slaves and their wives would be able to vote. I know it gets beaten to death, but it is worth remembering that the closest thing they had in the 18th century to our modern semi-automatic rifles was the fucking puckle gun, a beast of a weapon that required a tripod and thus couldn't be carried and shot at the same time, and fired a whopping 9 shots per minute. Then there's what we covered earlier in regards to militias, and fun fact, the Second Amendment might only exist so that slave states could prevent slave revolts. Some of those militias in question were slave patrols, and they wanted their right to form armed militias guaranteed so that they could control their slaves. You really don't know what a fun fact is, do you? I suppose I don't. But the main point I'm getting at here is that the conservative interpretation of the Second Amendment is divorced from the original meaning. But even if it did align with the original meaning, who cares? It would still be good to pass gun control legislation. It's a weird and arbitrary decision to pretend all our current laws need to be in line with how a bunch of dudes from the 1700s thought society should run. They're dead. They don't care. We're allowed to change the Constitution. That's how literally all of the amendments happened. We should be basing our laws off of our modern goals. We aren't aiming to prevent slave revolts, we're aiming to keep kids alive. Oh no! The cowboy straw-man stand-in for the anti-gun control movement, which in retrospect probably could have been better represented by, say, an NRA lobbyist because they're the ones actually controlling the legislation. Unfortunately, I do not own a suit and I do own a hat. My argument has been defeated! God, what a weirdo. Anyways, there's one more conservative argument I want to touch on, and that's the idea that you can't regulate evil. The claim is that mass shooters are just inherently evil people that will do mass shootings regardless of any legislation standing in the way. This seems rather at odds with their assertions that fixing mental health is a solution to the mass shooting problem, but contradiction is the norm with conservatives, so no big surprise there. What this assertion glosses over is that while sure, there will always be some degree of mass shootings, regulation will reduce the total number. The easier it is to commit a mass shooting, the more likely one is to be committed, and in America, where 77% of shooters acquire their guns legally, committing a mass shooting is about as easy as it can be. Neither I nor any other advocate of gun control believes that universal background checks will stop all gun deaths, but we know it will result in much fewer people dying, and that's more than enough reason to do it. Before we get into what can be done about all this, there's something I'd like to address. I've focused on mass shootings in this video because they're the most striking displays of the country's horrible policy in action. But I should note that passing gun control legislation would have positive effects far beyond just seeing less mass shootings in the news. Mass shootings account for a fraction of firearm deaths in the US. Gun control will save far more lives by just reducing firearm homicide, accidental shootings, and especially suicide. An analysis of states with varying laws found that mandatory gun storage alone resulted in a lower amount of homicides, suicides, and unintentional shootings. Our goal cannot be just to keep guns out of kids' schools, but also to keep them out of their hands. Now, we know what policies need to be implemented, so how do we go about making it happen? Now, this is where a lot of people will say, you should vote, end the video, and pat themselves on the back for a job well done. But this simply isn't enough. Yes, you should vote for people who support these policies. Encourage your friends to do so too. This channel is pro-voting. But we've been voting for decades, and we're only backsliding. It's almost like the entire system is set up in a manner that gives conservatives an unrepresentative share of the Senate, but that's another video. I would also recommend calling your congressperson and encouraging them to do their fucking job. But if being constructive isn't your thing, and you want to blow off some steam, there's always Plan B. Be mean to the politicians opposing gun control. Did you know that the phone numbers of politicians are public info? Call the ones you don't like. Call them a dick. Addresses too. Go to their house and protest. Unlike some things, it's actually a right guaranteed by the amendments. It probably won't accomplish anything. These conservative politicians are rather immune to even the slightest bit of shame. But at the very least, not a day should go by that these gutless chuds don't have to reckon with the people they've killed through inaction. But the job cannot rest solely on the shoulders of voters. Democrat politicians also need to adjust their strategy in turn. Hello to every Democratic politician, because you are all watching this video, and you're all going to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, Democratic politician, you've got a bit of a pickle on your hands. See, your party has a majority in the House and 50 members in the Senate. But every time you try to do something, it gets filibustered. Now, you could get rid of the filibuster with a majority vote, but a couple members of your party refuse to do that. They argue that it violates the intent of the Senate and represents a breach of conduct. The opposition party has shown no such qualms about breaching the codes of conduct, and indeed, it is through breaching the codes of conduct that they currently control the Supreme Court, which means that your party and the abortion, marriage, and voting rights of millions are even more fucked. Now, one approach to solve this would be to use primaries to hold Democrats to a higher standard for what policy positions they hold. On the day of the shooting in Uvalde, congressional Democrats were organizing elsewhere in Texas in support of Henry Cuellar, an incumbent congressional Democrat who opposes abortion and is backed by the NRA. As of recording this, his primary race still hasn't been called, but it looks like, thanks to the support of establishment Dems, he's going to narrowly beat progressive challenger Jessica Cisneros. And while I get the mentality behind electing more conservative Democrats, it's a reaching across the aisle move. Except you're not reaching across the aisle so much as you're just moving your side further into the aisle, while Republicans go further and further to the right, shifting the aisle to the right. This is a political science concept I just came up with. I call it the Alex Aisle, and it is my original idea. Please do not steal. Democrats treat policies that have near unanimous support as if they're serious wedge issues. But gun control only becomes a wedge issue when Democrats fail to take control of the narrative on it. When Republicans are able to spin the most basic of common sense reforms as an attack on the Constitution that will put you and your family at risk of being killed by transgender immigrants, they're able to mobilize their base to the extent no legislation gets through. I could talk for another half hour about the right-wing media machine's ability to create a narrative and the lack of an equally powerful system on the left. But the video has to end at some point. But to put it simply, Democrats came into this administration with a massive mandate, and should they fail to live up to it, things are going to get a lot worse. Progress has so far been halted by a commitment from some to seek bipartisanship at the expense of actually doing anything for the people. This is not a winning strategy. The cost of a commitment to decorum above all else is an ever-growing pile of dead kids. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to support me financially, you can go to my Patreon and get your name listed with the lovely patrons scrolling by right now, including my $10 and up patrons, Sleepy Boy Uwu. As you can see, I got a camera. I hope y'all like the new video format. And sorry for mispronouncing Uvalde the entire video. I read articles, I don't watch news, so sometimes I don't learn the pronunciation for stuff. So yeah.